Hello, this is your composition and texture assignment for Art 120 illustration. Today we're going to be working with the homework assignment that we've already completed with the composition of the plants and adding some textures to this that we've also created ourselves. So texture is the tactile grain of surfaces and substances. And in design, texture can be both physical and virtual. So today we're going to be looking at applying some physical textures from the real world and applying them to a virtual drawing that we've created to give a sort of look and feel of a little bit more of a tactile quality to this sort of flat 2D element that we're working with. So what you see on screen here is something similar to what we're going to be creating for this project. We're going to be using our large sketch paper to sample at least 4 to 6 different textures from the world around us. If you're at school within the classroom, we're going to step outside and sample a few different textures. If you're somewhere else, you can do the same thing. And it's easiest to use charcoal for this, some sort of lightweight charcoal, in order to pick up those textures appropriately. So the idea is to lay your paper over some sort of texture found in the real world, whether that be a metal grate or some sort of bricks or tile, possibly some sort of stone, anything with some sort of texture on it that we can transfer onto the paper using the charcoal. And from the composition homework assignment that we've created, we're going to then apply these different textures to different areas or shapes within that composition, as well as some different colors. So let's get started. At this point, you should have your images or scans of your composition as well as the textures. And when we open these up in Photoshop, there's a few steps that we want to follow first. So the first thing that we want to do is open up our textures and crop anything that we don't need within our actual image. For mine here, I've already kind of done that, but if you need to do that any further, you can use the crop tool over here and either change the size this way, or you can click and drag within the actual element as well. And once you're happy with the crop of your actual piece, I'll just tighten this up a little bit here on the bottom and on the left. We can just hit the enter button to apply that actual crop. Before you do that, though, you might have noticed that there is a lock on your layer. You might be seeing something like this when you first open up your file. If that is the case, you can just simply come over to this layer and hit the lock button to unlock that, and then we will be able to edit it further. So once we have unlocked our layer and we make our crop, then we're going to want to adjust our levels. I've already kind of done that to this particular drawing, or this image here, but if we come up here to Image, Adjustments, and Levels, we can actually bring down our darks a little bit and bring up our whites. And ideally, you want to bring your whites up so that the white paper is going to be pure white as well. Another way to do this is you can take your sample dropper over here for your white point and just click somewhere on your paper to assure that that is going to be pure white wherever that paper is. And then you can always adjust your midtones as well with your middle slider here. So on the left is going to be your darks, and then the middle is your midtones, and on the right is your whites, essentially. So once you're happy with this and you have a good contrast between your darks and your lights, you can go ahead and click OK. Sorry, I realized that wasn't on your screen right now. So these are your sliders here. I was using my white dropper here to click on the white areas to select that, and then you can change your darks with the slider all the way to the left, your midtones with the slider in the middle, and your highlights over here on the right. And again, once we're happy with the contrast, we can go ahead and click OK, and that should adjust your levels to give you a little bit more contrast throughout the actual piece. So at this point, we can go ahead and save this out. So I'm going to go up here to File, Save As. and I'm going to go ahead and save this out as a Photoshop. And I'm going to title this with my last name underscore comp underscore texture 1. And I'll go ahead and, there is no layers for this one, but we'll go ahead and leave that checked for now. Make sure you're putting it in the right spot you want to put that. And we'll go ahead and hit the save button there. I already have this file saved, so I'm going to go ahead and click replace. And it's bringing up this additional dialog box, which we can just click OK. So now we have that saved and we're ready to use these textures and bring them into our actual composition. So I'm going to go ahead and open up an image of my composition that I've taken. You can either scan in the image or take a picture. So from my Finder here, I'm just going to go ahead and drag that into Photoshop, my actual file. And in this case here, I need to do a rotation to this before I go any further. So if I come up here to image and image rotation, I can see that I actually need to do this particular one 90-degree clockwise in order to get it straight. And now I'm going to go ahead and again crop my image to give me just the area that I need to focus on. So by using the crop tool here, I'm just going to bring these into the corners a little bit tighter. And I'm also going to actually rotate this a little bit. You can see that it's kind of on a little bit of a slant. So if I'm still within the crop tool and I bring my mouse out to the right, it gives me the option to rotate this, and I can kind of use the grid there provided to get that as straight as possible. So I'm going to go with something like that and maybe change that just ever so slightly. And that looks pretty good to me. I might bring this top down just a little bit. So once I'm happy with that, I'll go ahead and hit the enter button to apply that crop. And now we're only working with this area that we need to. So again, once I've done that, I have my background layer here, and before I can make any edits, I need to actually unlock this. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my lock icon and unlock this so that I can make additional edits. And I'm going to do the same thing here and adjust my levels. So if I come up here to adjustments, levels, I again can see my slider bar here. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I want to make sure that some areas on the white part of the paper are going to be as white as possible. So I'm going to select my white sample eyedropper right here, which is all the way to the right. And I'm just going to go ahead and click into a sort of grayish area here. And you can see that there's still some areas that are a little bit grayer. And if I hit my Option key, it gives me the ability to see some of those areas that are pure white, as well as some areas that still have some sort of color. So if I actually hit my Option key, I can come down into one of these areas and say, well, I actually want this to be my whitest area. And you can see that it just starts reducing that more and more. And I'm just toggling on and off my Option button to see if there's still any areas of the paper that need to get fixed and sort of brought up to be brighter. So that's pretty good here. I have most of my areas are pretty white for my paper, but my black has lost a little bit of its quality. So I'm actually going to come back up here to my slider and go ahead and slide my darkest darks over a little bit, kind of right in the middle of that little hump that I have in this particular histogram for this image. And all of your histograms are going to be a little bit different. It just depends on the grayscale quality of the image. What works better is if you can take a picture or scan in the image and with decent sort of lighting where there's not some sort of big shadow coming in on the image. That's going to give you the best overall quality. So by sliding my darks up just a little bit more, I might even slide my midtones over to add a little bit more of a darker quality to some of those. And I'm pretty happy with that there, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now I have a pretty nice contrast between my darks and my lights here. And I can actually go in and start applying some different color and applying some different textures to these different areas within the composition as well. So within this layer, with it being unlocked, I can actually come over here to the left and select my magic wand tool. And as long as I have contiguous checked up here, and maybe a tolerance of about 100. Tolerance is how much you want it to actually pick up on that particular area, so you can adjust that and play with that accordingly. But let's go ahead and start about 100. I'm going to have my anti-alias clicked on and also contiguous. what Contiguous does is it's going to only select the shape or the color within that contrast. So for example, if I wanted to select this area here with Contiguous selected, I can go ahead and select just that area there. But if I deselected this by hitting Command D and unclicked Contiguous, it's actually going to select all my areas of white there, not just the one that sort of has this border. So again, I'm going to Command D to deselect. You can also do that up here. And I'm going to make sure that Contiguous is selected, so I'm just selecting that particular area within that composition. Now, within my Layers palette, I can actually come down here to the fourth little icon over, and that's your Create New Fill or Adjustment layer. And if I click on that, I'm going to go all the way up to the top and select Solid Color. And when I do that, it brings up this additional dialog box here where I can select a particular color, and anything that I want, I can select the particular hue over here on the slider on the right, and then the sort of value of that hue on the left over here. So once I select a color, I can go ahead and just click OK. And now we've applied that color to this particular area of the composition here using a clipping mask. So let's go ahead and do that one more time to another area within this composition. So I need to come back to the layer that has my actual artwork on it. And again, by using the magic wand, I'll select in an actual area, come over here to the fill layer, select solid color, and this time I'm going to change my color up a little bit here. And let's do it one more time. Again, I'm going to come down to my layer of my artwork, select in a different area. And if you've selected in one area of your artwork and you actually want to select in one additional, you can hold the Shift button and click in both of those. You can see how by holding the Shift and selecting in that additional area, it's actually grouping those two selections together. So again, I can come over here to my Create New Fill layer, go to Solid Color, and this time I'm going to add a little different hue as well. So I've added a few different colors to the actual composition, and in theory we would go through and create a fill for each one of these individual shapes within this composition. Now what I want to do is apply some textures within these compositions as well. So we need to bring in the previous file that we've created with the textures. So part 2, applying texture to our composition. So we've brought in our composition and applied some color to the different areas, and we've also edited our textures in preparation for applying them to our drawing. So now we want to actually bring these textures into this composition that we have. So the first thing that we want to do for this is we want to go into Photoshop and go to File, Place Embedded, and we're going to find that previous file that we've just saved out, wherever you have saved that out, as the PSD file, and we're going to go ahead and click Place. Now, when it drops it in there, it's going to constrain it to the proportions of our page here. So I actually want to make this a little bit larger right off the bat so that my textures are a nice high quality for me to experiment with, and I can always edit later on. So I'm just going to go ahead and use my Shift and Option key. By holding that together, we can expand this whole thing out from the center instead of just from one side. Shift and Option will expand from the center. And I'm going to go ahead and click Enter. So I've transformed this to go a little bit larger, and because I placed it as an embedded file, it's now embedded within this composition. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to place this texture within these several elements of the composition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to create a clipping mask for this particular texture to sit within these particular shapes. And then I'm going to duplicate that layer and do it for the different shapes that I have. So in this case, I have 3 different shapes that are colorized. So I'll be using at least 3 different textures to bring texture into those different areas. So what I can do first is figure out which area I want to apply this texture to first. So as long as I'm in my artwork layer down here at the very bottom, I can go back to my magic wand tool and reselect that area of blue that I have for this particular fill here. So within my artwork layer, I can use my magic wand tool and select that area of color. Then I can come back up here to my texture layer and make it visible again and highlight that layer so that I'm applying any changes to that specific layer. And we can see that I have these marching ants sitting on top of that actual texture. So down here at the bottom of our layers, there's actually an add layer mask button. So as long as I have this area already selected and I'm on the appropriate layer of this texture, I can just hit this add layer mask button and it'll apply that texture within that area that I had selected using my magic wand tool. Now, what I'd like to be able to do is actually see through this texture to be able to pull out some of that color that I've already applied. So up here at the top of our layer palettes, you'll see your blending options for each individual layer. So for this particular texture layer, as long as I have that highlighted, I can drop down this menu and start playing with different ways to apply this texture. You'll notice that each one of these has a different look and a feel depending on the contrast and the color that you're using. And you can kind of just go through here and experiment what you think looks best for each particular texture. And I would experiment using different blending modes for the different textures just to get a little bit more acquainted with them. So that looks pretty good. I've applied this texture to this specific area of color within the composition, but I actually want to shift this a little bit within that composition as well. So you'll notice within my layer here, I have two different thumbnails now. I have my thumbnail of my original artwork, and I have this new thumbnail of my clipping mask. And you can see that the area of white is what's being exposed to reveal this texture, and all the other areas are filled in with black, meaning it's hiding that texture behind this clipping mask. Same thing is happening with this color of fill here, essentially. So you'll also notice that between these two thumbnails, there's a lock icon. If I click on that lock icon, what it does is it enables me to manipulate these thumbnails individually versus the same thing. If I bring that icon back and I try to move this around, it's going to move that whole clipping mask around within that actual shape, right? But if I unclick that and I click on the thumbnail of my actual artwork, not the thumbnail of the clipping mask, but the thumbnail of my artwork, I can actually move the textures beneath that clipping mask to reveal any part of that textured paper that I want to for this particular area. So I might want to leave it with something like this for this one here, and then go and apply a different texture for the next color here. So let's do the same thing. We now want to apply a different texture to this area of orange here. So we could either go up to File, Place Embedded, and bring that file back in, or we can use this same layer here and just delete this clipping mask. First, we'd want to duplicate the layer and then delete the clipping mask. So if we hold the Option button over this particular layer and drag up, you'll notice that it brings up two different arrows telling me that I'm copying that layer. And if I drop it right on top, you'll notice that it created a copy of that particular layer. So again, I'm going to go back. All I did was hold the Option key, click on this layer, and bring it up to copy that particular layer there. So you'll notice that the clipping mask is applied. It's copied that entire layer over. So I actually want to erase this clipping mask and make a new one. So again, I'm going to select the thumbnail of the actual clipping mask, and I'm just going to hit I'm going to right click and select Delete Layer Mask. And that will actually delete the layer mask. So now I have this texture sitting over this entire thing again. And the reason it looks a little different is because we still have a different blending mode on, right? So we could change that if we want to see it a little bit differently. But this time I want to apply the texture to this particular area over here. So again, I want to come down to my original artwork layer, go over to my magic wand, select within that area here, and I want to come back up to the texture of the layer that I'm working on. And as long as I have that selection over the layer of the texture that I'm working on, I can again just come down here to the Add Layer Mask button, click that, and it will go ahead and apply that texture within that new area of the composition. So again, if I wanted to move that texture around behind that clipping mask, I could just unlock my two different thumbnails here, click on the thumbnail of the actual texture, come up here to my directional arrows, and I can actually move this around to include whichever texture I want to for this particular one here. So we might find that for some of these we need to also make these textures a little bit larger. So we can always come up here to Image, Edit, Transform, and or we could go to Free Transform actually. That'd probably be the easiest one to go. And then with Free Transform, it's going to bring up the ability to enlarge this again. So by clicking on an area of the artwork, I can just hold that Shift button to keep those constraints proportional and move that texture to any part of this artwork that I want to. So essentially you'll repeat that process for all of these. And again, like I said, once you have several different textures going on for these different layers, I would encourage you to come up here to the blending modes and start experimenting with how these textures, or how the blending mode is going to affect that texture on that particular color here. Because what you'll see is you'll get different results for each one. And it really just depends on what you're going for that particular look and feel of that texture. But you can certainly experiment with different ways of blending modes. You can also adjust the opacity for that particular texture. If we wanted some sort of blending mode like pin light here, but we wanted to actually bring down the texture to about 40%, we could also adjust that opacity there. And as long as I'm selected on this particular layer, all of those changes will be made to that particular layer. So essentially, you are going to go through within your composition and apply different colors to each one of the different shapes that are enclosed within your composition. And then you're going to bring in your texture file and apply a texture using a clipping mask to each one of those shapes within that composition as well. Experiment with the blending mode on that color, and then save out to your file once you're done. So once I've completed this with all my different shapes in here, filled with colors and textures applied to all of them, I again want to come up here to File, Save As, and I'm going to go ahead and save this with my first initial, last name, composition, texture, and you can save that to wherever you would like to save that. You want to make sure that you save this as a Photoshop format so that you can come back and edit it if you need to as well. And you also want to make sure that layers is toggled on so that you will save out all these individual layers. So once you have it titled correctly in the correct spot as a Photoshop format and the layer is selected, you can hit save, hit OK, and you can always come back and revisit this and edit it at any later time. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and hopefully you find this practice a little helpful to apply some textures, possibly to your self-portrait or any of the other projects that we'll be doing in this class.